we were sitting around trying to work out what we'd call the band. You know, thought we might call it the Psychedelic Pumpkins. And in the end, Wendy just turned around and said, "Call it f***ing Chain." And that was it. It was Chain.
Phil Manning, welcome to the Australian Music Vault.
Thank you, Jenny.
Phil, I was wondering if you could tell us about your first experience of live music.
Well, my first experience of live music was probably when I was about 7 or 8, competing in piano Eisteddfods. And I was incredibly nervous, and nothing's changed. And so, yes, my first experience of live music was performing myself. Then, as far as bands, getting into the band music industry side of it, was I started to take a big interest when I was about 14 or so because of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and all those 60s pop bands from England. And then I started going to local dances in my hometown of Devonport in Tasmania, and saw bands like the Cherokees and the Flies and, the Melbourne bands that would come across to Tasmania to play. I did 8 years classical piano as a child and got to really dislike it. And then when the Beatles, Stones came on the scene, I wanted to play guitar, and it took me a while to convince my parents, number one, that I didn't want to play piano anymore, and number two, that I wanted a guitar. And so I stopped playing piano about 14, had a ukulele for a while, and then I got my first guitar at about 15. My first guitar, I had to work in my dad's shop to pay it off. It was an acoustic German-made guitar, but it was called a Broadway or something. It had pickups on it, so I could play it through an amplifier, and that's what I wanted. At about 15, I was really interested in, the music. I'd been listening to the music of the Beatles, the Stones, the Yardbirds, Pretty Things, all those great English bands. But I really started to catch on to blues when I went to art school. When I was 17, I went to Hobart Art School, and through going to Hobart, I met all these interesting people, including an American guy who had a fabulous collection of blues albums by the likes of Lead Belly, Robert Johnson, all these early 20s and 30s blues players. And that sort of really cemented my love for blues. Even though I was going into the blues thing quite sort of heavily, I still liked the Stones because they had their roots in the same thing. They were just very clever songwriters as well. And so throughout, really getting into the blues thing, I've still kept my love for pop music. I still enjoy listening to the Beatles or the Stones, the things I grew up with. I first started playing with other musicians when I was 15. As soon as I got my first guitar and started to be able to play it a little bit, I had a friend who, strangely enough, was known as Charlie, and he was a Charlie Watts, and he played drums. So Charlie and I started messing around, and then a friend across the road played a bit of guitar, Philip Ford, and so we started to play a few things together, and then played at a couple of functions at school and at high school. And so that was the beginning of playing with other musicians. When I first started playing in front of live audiences, I think the thing I remember most about it was the sheer terror. And but at the same time, an incredible satisfaction, because it was living the dream. It was doing what by that stage I'd had a few years of listening to this music and wanting to do something in that music scene. And to be actually standing on stage, making a big racket and playing in front of an audience was just incredibly exciting. The journey from Tasmania to eventually end up in Chain was fairly roundabout. This big pop singer from the mainland, as we'd call it, came to Hobart. His name was Tony Worsley, and he'd just lost his guitar player to the Bee Gees. Vince Maloney had gone to join the Bee Gees. And I fronted up and asked him if I could apply for the job. And 2 days later, I was in Melbourne rehearsing to play that night at one of the Melbourne dances with Tony Worsley and the Blue Jays. I stayed with Tony for about, I don't know, I lose track of time, but after about 6 or 7 months, I left that band, travelled back to Melbourne and joined the Bay City Union, which had amongst its members Matt Taylor, and the bass player, the rhythm guitarist at the time, later to be the bass player, was Glenn Wheatley. And Glenn Wheatley, of course, of Little River Band fame, John Farnham fame. And following that band, I went to Perth to work with the Laurie Allen Review for a short period of time, then back to Melbourne, and then a band from Perth that won the Hoadley's Battle of the Band in Perth came across to Melbourne, and they were called the Beaten Tracks. And their guitar player, Dave Hole, had given notice, and so they asked me to join. I went back to Perth, worked with them as the Beaten Tracks, which was a very poppy band. And then when we came back to Melbourne, we got a young female singer here named Wendy Saddington, and she came up with the name Chain, actually. We were sitting around trying to work out what we'd call the band, you know, thought we might call it the Psychedelic Pumpkins or, you know, names like that. And in the end, Wendy just turned around and said, "Call it fucking Chain." And that was it. It was Chain. It became Chain. Wendy's rationale for Chain was from Aretha Franklin's Chain of Fools. And that was actually a fairly apt title, because we weren't exactly the most sensible bunch of guys on the earth when we formed the bands. And then, of course, Chain's lineup changed from when we formed in 1968. It changed several times before it settled on the lineup of Matt Taylor on vocals and harmonica, Barry Sullivan on bass, Barry Harvey on drums, and myself on guitar. We stopped in at Sydney on one of our travels back to Melbourne and recorded Black and Blue. And then in 1971, we had a hit with it. And the other notable thing is that at that time, when we arrived in Melbourne, Matt Taylor had been talking to a young fellow down here about possibly managing Chain. And that happened to be Michael Gudinski, who at the time was working for an agency here. Michael took over the management of Chain, and through his clever planning and stuff, we got the most unlikely hit out of Black and Blue, because it was such a dirge of a song, and yet it became a huge hit. And that was a great deal to do with Michael and his management skills. Michael Gudinski took over Chain's management and immediately started to promote us. And one of the most clever things that he did, and Matt Taylor and I only realised this recently, is that he would go out, he'd put us on one of his dances as the headline act. And he'd go around the record shops during the week and buy up all the copies of our single, which would mean that it would go onto the charting lists. And then he'd offer, come and see Chain on Saturday night, pay your $1.50 or whatever it was to get into the dance, and you'll get a free copy of Chain's Black and Blue. So he was actually getting his money back, but he basically bought us into the chart. And once that happened, the radio stations who didn't like Black and Blue at all, they hated it in fact, they were forced to play it. And that created its own momentum, and then the audience started going out and buying them. So that's just one of the sort of clever things that Michael did to get, you know, it's the sort of thing that has always gone on in the music industry. But we didn't realise that Michael had done that because we were all too stoned at the time to take notice of anything. Black and Blue came about when Matt Taylor joined the band, and we went for our first rehearsal in Brisbane at a place called the Red Orb, little downstairs place. And we were, what will we learn? What will we do? And I said, I've got this great little riff I've been working on, which is the Black and Blue guitar riff. And Matt said, oh, I've always wanted to write a work song. And so we played around with this riff a bit and came up with some ideas. And then Matt went down, sat in a corner and wrote the lyrics out. And we had the song complete at the first rehearsal. And then we just kept playing it and developing it, and eventually recorded it, as I said, in Sydney on the way to Melbourne. And yeah, we were astonished it became a hit, though. Black and Blue was very definitely styled after an old-time chain gang song, in which someone would sing something and then the people would all go, ugh, and hit the rocks with their picks or whatever it was. And so consequently, we took that into the song, that idea into the song. But there was also the backdrop of the Vietnam War and the protests against it. And there was some pretty heavy-handed police action with protesters. So Matt sort of included some of that in it, in the backdrop of Black and Blue. And I think that that's possibly one of the reasons why it took off, because people interpreted their own idea of what this work song was about. And some people took it as being, you know, people that had been sent to prison on protests. And there's a lot of ways of interpreting it. And in fact, the backdrop, or the background singing says, "We're groaning." So you work me so hard, my back's near broken. Then the answer is, "We're groaning." But some people thought it was things like red roses and all these strange versions that people sort of hear into the lyrics, you know, that they misunderstand them. And people still love it. That's what really amazes me. And we go out and play it now, and the audience all jump up and all sing "We're Groaning." It's really quite funny after all this time. Matt Taylor has a very distinctive voice, and he developed that learning to sing American blues, basically. And but he tends to sing more like an opera singer, in a sense. Has an extremely strong voice and really sings big. In fact, it's very painful to stand next to him and try and sing a harmony on the same microphone with him. But he developed this tone, and you can hear that on Black and Blue. It's quite guttural, and very powerful, and as a result, it has quite an element of a black sound to it, I think, anyway. For those who aren't familiar with chain music, first listening to it, you would probably be surprised at how unusual a sound it is, because we'd listened to all this blues, and we'd learnt to play Chicago-style blues and some Texas-style blues, and it was all very derivative. We'd learnt to play music based on the British version of blues. And then about 1970, we just started jamming on. We'd pick a riff and start jamming on it, and then Matt Taylor would come up with some lyrics, and the next thing it would gradually take a form, and we'd have written this song. But rather than sitting down and writing a song and then learning it to perform it, it sort of it developed organically, and so we had we had songs that sometimes went for 15 minutes and that sort of thing. Lots of dirgy harmonica, and but we were a very tight band, and even though we had a certain looseness in our form of music, the drums, guitar, the rhythm section was really tight, you know, and that was part of our sound. When Chain first started to play around Melbourne, Sydney, there was a mixture of places. Melbourne, for instance, didn't have really any licensed venues. So we play big suburban dances or the inner city discotheques like Birdie's, the Thumping Tum, places like that, Sebastian's, or the big dances, for instance, Q Club or the Canterbury Ballroom. And as I said, they're all unlicensed venues. And bit by bit, as people got into the what I call the underground scene, you'd be tending to play to people sitting down watching rather than, you know, they'd all be stoned and sitting down listening to the music. And these dances were run by Michael Gudinski, Bill Joseph, Michael Browning. There were a number of local promoters in Melbourne who ran these. When we'd perform in Sydney, we'd tend to perform in more licensed venues because they had these leagues clubs and RSL clubs. The rest of Australia was mainly dances, unlicensed venues. But around about 71, the rock music started to move into hotels. And so Chain would find itself playing at the Village Green Bloodbath on a Saturday afternoon. And they'd get really out of hand and there'd be fights and, you know, just got really wild. And bit by bit, the suburban dancers moved, they just basically stopped. And the music moved into the pub scene, which was good for some acts. In Chain's case, it wasn't so good for us because we were endeavouring to be quite a musical act rather than a dance act, you know, dance band. And but the music scene still thrived once it got into the pub scene, and there were many venues. Wendy Saddington was a part of Chain for the first few months or so. In that time, we developed even though we didn't have any records out, we developed a really strong following in the disco, what they called the discotheques, but they were really underground clubs, you know, the underground music scene. And when Chain moved to Sydney after a while with Wendy Saddington, she became a real star overnight almost. We had a great following up there. But Wendy, when she got to Sydney, Wendy Saddington in Sydney, tended to come across the gay and lesbian scene, which she was a part of herself. And that sort of, because we were really such a bunch of blokes, it tended to pull her away, and eventually she left Chain, and she worked with Jeff St John and the Copper Wine for a period of time, and then she went into other things, the art, the sort of very arty thing she went into. I think Wendy Saddington was very unique at that time. There were other women singing blues or blues-associated music, great singers like Margaret Roadnight. She was more towards soul music in a way than the other singers around at the time. But she was very shy when it came to the side of the music industry that you have to do to be a big star, which is you have to be available for interviews, and you've got to be able to, you know, make yourself available to the public. Wendy was basically very shy. Well, she always seemed very shy to me anyway. And I think that it sort of held her back and tended to keep her more in a sort of an underground niche, whereas she should have become huge, really, in the same way that later on Renee Gayer became a big national star. Wendy Saddington could, with her voice and looks and everything, could have been a huge national star. I don't think Wendy really wanted that. She was a quieter person, and very private. She just loved music. And what made her very special was that she'd taken a lot of her influence from the great Bessie Smith. And there weren't a lot of singers around that could sing in that style. There's always been some female singers that can scream, but Wendy could sing as well as scream. And when Wendy actually screamed, it was terrifying. Because she was a tiny wee thing. She wasn't a very big woman. But when she opened her mouth, this huge sound came out of it. But she had beautiful control. She could sing quietly and then scare the living daylights off you. And she was great. Sunbury was a wonderful festival. I remember, not that I remember much, I remember that the first one was just a real thrill because it was something new, and it still had the elements of the hippie days about it. By the time it got to the final Sunbury, the fourth one, it had become more of a booze fest, largely because of Billy Thorpe, I think. I'm not sure how that suck more piss thing developed at Sunbury, but I know that Billy Thorpe really took the festival over and sort of made it his, really, by the last two, because he was so loud and so big and powerful. And Billy Thorpe's always been a fabulous singer. And the audience just absolutely loved him. Billy Thorpe was the real hit at Sunbury. You can't get around that. I met Billy Thorpe in the late 60s, and Billy's band, the Aztecs and Chain, became really good buddies, and we used to get together and party, and we did the first festival in Australia, I think, at Arimba in the late 60s. We did that one together and ended up back at the Here Disco afterwards, jamming with Billy and Lobby, and Billy Thorpe, Lobby Lloyd, Barry Sullivan, Barry Harvey, myself, Matt Taylor. And we often got together and played just a few songs together. And then in the early 70s, Warren Morgan and Billy Thorpe did an album called Thumping Pig and Puffing Billy, which I played on. And yes, over the years, I've played quite often with Billy Thorpe, but not as a member of never as an actual member of his band, just as more in a jamming situation or getting up together. And quite often, Chain would do something with Billy Thorpe, and then at the last couple of songs, Matt Taylor and I would get up with Billy and play. So a lot of that went on. Well, Billy Thorpe, of course, had been a big pop star in the mid-60s, and you know, we had things like Poison Ivy and Somewhere Over the Rainbow and all that stuff that he was known for. But then he moved into a more blues area and started playing guitar a lot more. And by the time Sunbury came along, he'd already developed this reputation for being incredibly loud and really, really rocky and bluesy. And at the same time, he still had the fact that he'd been a big pop star. He had the confidence and the drive to get out there, and he was just a great showman in that he could convince anyone that he was totally confident. And by the time he got to the last couple of Sunburys, the festivals, they were his festival, really. He owned them, as they like to say. I think Billy transitioned from a pop singer to a much more heavy rock thing. That was just a completely natural development for him. For instance, we would get together and share albums. When the Beatles' White Album came out, I remember being around we were either around at Billy Thorpe's house or he was around at ours, listening to it. And there was a natural evolution that came about between the pop days of the mid-60s to the hippie days, to moving into the early 70s, and the advent of bands, advent of Cream, Jimi Hendrix, Deep Purple, Led Zeppelin. That put a whole heavy emphasis on it. And I think Billy Thorpe took that and developed with it. And of course, he started writing material, and he and I would get together and show each other different chord things. And so from what I can see, it was just a natural evolution for Bill. And he became a very creative. And of course, when he went off to America, he went into a whole new heavy thing over there. And but he, as I like to say, he always had the confidence of a full-on pop star, and he had that right through, right to the very end. The first couple of Sunburys that I had actually left Chain, and I was doing other things. I've got an idea from memory. The first year, I might have been with Leo DeCastro and friends, or perhaps it was Mighty Mouse. Then I did it with Chain. This was a reformed Chain with Mal Logan on keyboards, Barry Sullivan on bass, Tony Lunt on drums, and myself. That was when that was I think the year that they had Deep Purple and it got rained on, and they lost a lot of money, and the festival ground to a halt. I don't have any recollection of being paid for the final Sunbury. I'm sure it happened, but I don't remember it. That was certainly a time in my life where we smoked an awful lot of dope and took magic mushrooms and acid and stuff like that. So it's a pretty hazy time. The main thing that took me in and out of Chain several times was our constant touring. I always had this other side of me that was tearing me away from being on the road, tearing me away from playing loud rock music. And that was a more gentle side, more a singer-songwriter side, more an acoustic side. And I, to this day, still like that. But in those days, there was no balance. If you were in a band, everyone had to be in the band and tour and feed yourselves. So there was never time for the other side of my personality to get out. And eventually that would boil over, and I'd go the other way for a time, and then back into the band thing for a while. And in recent years, of course, I've got the balance much better than that, and I'm able to do both and really enjoy both. As a musician, touring constantly, there's a tendency to not view yourself as a musician or not view yourself as getting somewhere, because you're constantly grinding away night after night just to make a living. However, in my case, I started to accept myself as being a well-known musician very early on, when we had Black and Blue and Judgment, and then we had our gold album. And so I had a reasonable self-esteem, actually, and not that I'd say I was overconfident, because I've never been incredibly confident, but I still had a reasonable respect for myself and a respect for having a name, and I've always had that, and that's been a really good thing, because you certainly need it in this industry to survive. I went to a concert at Festival Hall to see the Dutch band Focus, and the guitar player, Jan Akkerman, was playing this guitar that it looked like a Gibson Les Paul, but it looked a bit bigger, and anyway, it had a wonderful sound. And I tried to find out what he was playing, and I went in to speak to a guy I knew at Brashes in Melbourne City named Frank Hinton, and talked about trying to find out what this guitar was. And Frank came up with the idea of taking me out to Mayton and getting Mayton to make me something that would suit my specs, suit what I was trying to do. And so I sat down and drew a template of it, or drew up what I wanted, came up with the ideas of what sort of sounds I'd like from it, and spoke to Bill May at Mayton and got the project underway. And then it came out as known as a Phil Manning custom stereo. I was trying to design a guitar that would serve two functions. As I mentioned, I was always torn between loud electric playing or sort of softer acoustic style of things. So I tried to design a guitar that was going to suit both needs, which meant that it was a semi-solid guitar. It had sound chambers, and it had various switchings between the pickups that would create a wide range of sound tones, so that I could use them for both. And I did. I was doing some solo work, and I'd use that for my solo work, and then I'd go and play in loud bands with it. And it functioned really well. It was a fairly complex guitar in the end, but it worked, and a lot of people liked it, and it was the best-selling electric in Australia for a couple of years. And then later on, Brashes moved on to something else, and it went by the wayside. But it still sells today as a sort of vintage item, and people get really good money for them. I think the most exciting thing about the 70s for me was that having got a name as a blues player, and of course being in Chain, or having been in Chain, promoters such as Michael Chagg, Michael Gudinski, Michael Koppel and Zev Isaacs, Paul Dainty, a lot of these international promoters started bringing out blues acts, and they needed a support artist for them because of the Musicians Union rulings. And being one of the few blues people, I ended up landing nearly all the support acts. So I was going around touring Australia with the likes of Muddy Waters, Freddie King, Sonny Terry Brownie McGee, Albert Collins. There were just so many American blues and English blues musicians that I got to support, and to travel around in the tour bus with them and get to know them. And so that was very exciting for me. and it still goes on today. I still get a lot of shows that I'll go and support someone, and I just really enjoy it. Yeah, it's really enjoyable like I've just finished a tour with Paco Peña, the Gregorian brothers, and Jim Pennell, great jazz player, and that was great. And we actually did collaborations together, and that was fabulous. The early recording scene in Australia was what I call a pretty amateurish thing, up until the late 60s, early 70s, when we started to see some really savvy engineers come along. And Melbourne was a great hub of that in those times. And although there were quite a few studios in Melbourne, the two noticeable ones were Armstrong's Audio-Visual, or just Armstrong's at the time, and Channel 9 TCS studios. And there were a number of engineers that really were incredibly important to the music scene at that time. And you could really bring them down to a few names. The engineers that I think of were initially, say, Roger Savage from Armstrong's, and then John French from Channel 9 TCS, and he was an incredible influence and on sound. He recorded some of the Chain stuff. He recorded lots of Dingoes, Ross Wilson material. He was a famous name. And of course, John Sayers, also John worked a lot of studios actually, but there were just a number of these great engineers that were so instrumental and so much a part of creating the sound of the bands that came out. And of course, the other engineer that really comes to mind from that period of time from Armstrong's was Ernie Rose. Ernie Rose had a huge input into many albums that formulated part of the Melbourne scene. I think the 80s and the 90s were very much the same for me personally. Ever since the mid-70s, I've just tended to do an incredible amount of support work for big international artists because basically I'm one of the few blues guys that's got a name in the pop world. So I'm sort of known in the blues and the folk country, in the country markets, but I'm also known as sort of a pop artist as well. And the other thing that happened during the 80s and the 90s was moving into a lot of festivals. And I was lucky because I was seen by, say, a jazz festival as being a blues player, and blues and jazz are very close. They spin off each other. I was seen in the folk scene as being a blues artist in the folk way, because I'd go there and play my acoustic folk blues and my original music, which is very akin to it. And then even with the country, I was going and doing country festivals and playing to boot scooters, can you believe it or not? But it's always been good, and most of it's come. I always look back at and thank Michael Gudinski for this, because Michael's management of Chain got Matt Taylor and Phil Manning into the national psyche really effectively, and Matt Taylor and myself have had a career ever since through that. So we always really have a lot of feeling for Michael Gudinski. Working as a musician coming into 2010, there's one noticeable difference to, say, when we were touring back in the 70s and particularly the early 80s, and that is the lack of a national circuit. Chain would, in the early 80s, Chain would start a 12 or 13-week tour in Queensland and work maybe 5-6 nights a week and end up in South Australia. So, you know, we were just on the road the whole time for 12 or 13 weeks. Now, to go from Queensland to South Australia and tour today, you'd be lucky to find 13 gigs, let alone 13 weeks of gigs. And so I find that's a noticeable change. And another noticeable change is that as I've got older, I've moved my acoustic thing has taken a lot more of a front seat, and I tend to play a lot of small festivals and lovely licensed restaurants or little community theatre shows, and that's really delightful. I love intimacy with the acoustic work, and you can basically have conversations with the audience, and when you are dealing with a very intimate audience, someone might even ask you before the show starts or something. They might say, "Listen, can you talk a bit about something? Can you tell us a bit about Sunbury, or can you tell us something about Billy Thorpe?" Or, you know, people love to hear little personal stories, and so you can weave them into the performance, and it's great. I tend to be a bit of a loner, and I don't really do a lot of collaboration work. But so saying, I'll tend to go along they have like these little blues clubs, and they'll have young blues musicians that will go along and perform. And I often go along as a guest artist to those and then collaborate with the young guys. I did a great little collaboration with Bongo Starkey from Skyhooks and myself playing with the Aaron Shembry band. And Aaron's a really hotshot young guitar player, coming on really well. He's a great player. And but as I said, I don't do a great deal of collab. That could probably change as I hit 70 next year, and I'm sort of just slowing down a little bit, and so there's quite a likelihood that I might do more collaboration work. What music has meant to my life is that I haven't had to do an ordinary job, and because the last thing I wanted to do when I left high school was have a job. I just wanted to be a musician. And even though there's been a few times in my life when I had to go and get a job just to get through a tough period, I have mainly been a professional musician since I was 18 years old. And being able to be a musician has just been a wonderful freedom for me. And I consider myself an incredibly lucky human being that I've been able to follow my dream, follow my heart, and follow absolutely love music, and I love painting too, and so I get to do both.